The first time I gambled, I was 8 years old. My family was visiting Puerto Rico, and we all went to a horse racing track. It was a cloudy day, and to me, the track felt like a giant wooden boat, except instead of water, we were surrounded by dust and Puerto Rican flamboyant trees, which were covered in impossibly red flowers. I loved it there. My parents gave me $1 to bet on any horse I wanted, and I chose a long shot, 5-1 odds, and I won. So all of a sudden, I had more money than I think I'd ever had. When we left the track, we walked by this old man that was asking for money. He had white scruffy hair, and he was all the way hunched over, and he was the most desperate-looking person I'd ever seen. And I walked over to him, and I gave him the $5 bill that I'd won. And as he took it, he got down on one knee, and his whole body just shook with the effort, and his eyes shone, and he looked right at me, and he said over and over, "Que Dios te bendiga, que Dios te bendiga, que Dios te bendiga." And I didn't speak Spanish then, so I was surprised that I could understand what he was saying. But I could understand because I'd been hearing those exact words every time my grandmother called our house. At the end of every call, my mom would hand me the phone, and my grandmother would say, "Que Dios te bendiga," and I knew that my job was to say, "Bendición." "Que Dios te bendiga, mijo." Bendición, grandma. I didn't know what those words meant or that anybody else said them. I just thought it was her way of saying, "I love you," which it was. And if there was anybody in the world that I was certain loved me, it was her. I was her only grandson, and my whole life she referred to me as her crown prince. She wore these big fur coats, and she drove a beautiful golden Camry. And from the day she bought that car, she'd been telling me that she was going to leave it to me in her will. She taught me how to dance the merengue. She took me to my first casino, and one Christmas she drove all the way from her house in New York City to our house in Western New York to bring me my first guitar. And so when this man outside the track was saying, "Que Dios te bendiga, que Dios te bendiga, que Dios te bendiga," I thought he was saying, "I love you, I love you, I love you." And I felt like I'd fixed him, like I'd changed him, and everything made a new kind of sense. All I had to do was choose the right horse in the morning, and in the afternoon I could change somebody's life. I could make the world better. I could be good. 12 years later, my grandmother passed away. I was a sophomore at a fancy private college, and George W. Bush was giving tax cuts to rich people, and I resented most of my classmates for having all this privilege and not really doing anything to help anyone. And I hadn't realized it yet, but I resented myself too for the same reason. And a few days after she died, my grandmother's golden Camry showed up outside of my dorm. And she also left me some money. She left me $3,000 in a savings bond that I was told would turn into a lot of money if I left it alone until my retirement. And I had every intention of doing that. And then 6 months later, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do for the summer, and I found out my great-grandparents had this apartment in San Juan that was now just sitting there empty. And so I applied for a research grant to go to the University of Puerto Rico and write a paper about my grandfather's cousin, this guy named Jose Trias Monge, who was one of the writers of the Puerto Rican Constitution. The Puerto Rican Constitution is widely thought of as a piece of garbage. An opinion even he shared by the end of his life. It essentially made sure that Puerto Rico would remain a colony of the United States, which it still is. And I wanted to write about how his opinion had changed over that 50-year period. But I didn't get the grant, and I still wanted to do the project. And so I looked at that savings bond, which had grown to $3,000.42, and I decided that's how I could fund the project. I thought that would get me through the summer with enough money left over to buy books in the fall. I told myself my grandmother would be happy that that's how I was using her money. And so I went down to Puerto Rico. And when I got to the apartment, it was clear that nobody had lived there since the first George Bush was president. It was right on the beach, and it was in the process of becoming the beach. All of the surfaces were turning into sand. But it had everything I needed. It had a bed and a couch and a little kitchen and a TV that only got Bravo and a closet that was completely full of collector's boxes of Crown Royal whiskey. The only condition for me staying there was that I wasn't allowed to go out at night. And so I brought my guitar with me, and I told myself that was going to be the summer where I finally learned how to play it. I thought I might even try playing and singing in the street for extra money. The first week I was there, I took the bus every morning to the University of Puerto Rico to work on my project. It was slow going. My Spanish still wasn't any good, and it took me like 3 days just to find the right library. And then at the end of the week, it occurred to me that nobody cared if I did the project or not, and that my grandmother never would have suggested that I write a research paper. That wasn't her style at all, and it didn't really feel like mine either, and so I quit. And I decided to focus on playing guitar instead. I started practicing every day, learning dozens and dozens of songs, telling myself I was getting better, that I was almost ready to go play in the street, but the truth was I'd only really learned one song, this murder ballad by Bob Dylan called The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll. All the other songs, I knew the chords, but I just couldn't figure out how they worked. I couldn't figure out how they fit together. I also could not sing. In high school, I'd been the only person that I'd ever heard of who'd been cut from our school choir. I'd opened my mouth to sing with no idea what was going to come out. Every day in that apartment, I'd practice and practice and practice until I got too frustrated, and then I'd go sit in front of the TV and wonder why I was trying to do something I had no aptitude for, something I was naturally awful at. Also, the idea of going out and playing and singing in the street was completely terrifying to me, which was not stage fright, it was appropriate, because I was terrible. I ended up drinking a lot of Crown Royal and spending a lot of time watching Project Runway marathons on Bravo. And then I was almost a month into summer, and I'd already used a good chunk of my grandmother's money, and for what? I wasn't doing anything. And the money was going faster than I expected. The median household income in Puerto Rico is less than half what it is in the poorest parts of the United States, but the cost of living isn't much lower, and some things like groceries usually cost significantly more. And so there I was, living on the beach, relatively wealthy for the first time in my life, and I was just sitting around all day, watching TV, getting drunk, feeling frustrated and defeated by songs. What would Tim Gunn say if he saw me? Or Heidi Klum, or Hattie Carroll. I decided to go out and find a job. The unemployment rate in Puerto Rico is always at least double what it is in the United States, and usually much, much higher than that. I did not find a job. And so, finally, I packed up my guitar, took the bus to Old San Juan where the cruise ships come in, found a little square, put my guitar case on the ground in front of me, and I played my one song. William Zanzinger killed poor Hattie Carroll with a cane that he twirled around his diamond ring finger. Before I got to the first chorus, a group of tourists came by and dropped a pamphlet into my guitar case. Inside was a picture of Jesus and the words, "May God bless you and keep you," which in Spanish is "Que Dios te bendiga." There was also a $5 bill in there. I played The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll 20 or 30 times that day, and then the next day, and then the next, and then eventually I stopped playing that song and started making up my own, and I stopped worrying that I couldn't play other people's songs, and I stopped being so scared to go out there, and I stopped caring whether or not anybody was listening to me or whether or not I was making any money. I just had this feeling that what I was doing was useful. And it was the first time I felt like something could be useful without really being of service to anyone. I wasn't adding anything to the lives of the tourists in San Juan. They didn't care whether I was there or not, but to me, writing and performing the songs just felt important. I felt like I was moving through a landscape that nobody had ever seen before, like I was in the same line of work as Neil Armstrong. And I know that maybe that doesn't mean anything, that maybe it's just vanity and pretentiousness and delusion and the same sort of entitlement that I'd been critical of in my classmates, but it just didn't feel that way to me. And it still doesn't. It feels like real work. And that feeling is the only reason I can give for doing it. At the end of the summer, when I flew back to my dad's house, my inheritance was mostly intact. I was glad that I hadn't wasted my grandmother's money. I was glad that I'd spent the summer doing something that was hard for me, something that she would have liked. I packed up my golden Camry and drove back to school. And on the way, I made a pit stop in Rochester, New York. I'd heard there was a shop there that was like a museum for guitars, and it was. They had all these glass cases full of hundreds and hundreds of beautifully used guitars. And they had these back rooms where you could bring any one you wanted and play for however long you wanted. After 3 hours, I left that store with a Gibson J45 guitar that cost exactly all of the money that I had. That year, I didn't buy books for any of my classes. I got mostly B's, Obama got elected, and I started thinking I might spend the rest of my life writing songs. Que Dios te bendiga.